of Columbia. There was some confusion that happened yesterday and last night, which I hope got straightened out for his sake. Apparently, because he has lawyers from Florida, they have to file what is called, they have to have filed for them, what's called a motion pro hoc vice in order to be allowed to practice in a court where they are not admitted. This is a very pro forma thing to do. It happens all over the country when a local lawyer will move for a lawyer from out of state to come in. Here we're in the federal courts. Well, apparently, as of last night, they had not filed. Then the court had reminded them that they had a certain amount of time to file. Then they filed, and then by last night the court had noted that the filing was erroneous. So they had to straighten it out before 11 o'clock this morning. So that was my news from last night before they got there today. But that's not an auspicious beginning for lawyers who are coming from outside the jurisdiction.
Right. So he's facing 7 charges: witness obstruction of justice, witness tampering, obstruction of justice,
false statements.
Yeah, false statement. How serious are these charges?
Well, they're serious because they carry a maximum prison sentence in the vicinity of 45 years. Now, while saying that, as we know, that's adding up every charge, and whether or not Roger Stone, if he were convicted or pled guilty to any of these charges, would ultimately go to prison is, of course, a question left for a court. And we never really see, in cases of this sort, someone going to prison for the maximum of 45 years. However, when you make false statements, I mean, I understand witness tampering sounds so much worse, but when you make false statements to the government or to a committee in Congress, those people get really upset. And those are the cases, it's always the false statement, it's always the cover-up, it's always the fibbing that winds up getting people thrown into prison.
Yeah. I mean, he's, at this point now, he's the 6th individual that's close to Trump that is pleading guilty. And
well, no, he's not pleading guilty.
He's not pleading, sorry, shouldn't plead, that has been indicted by the Mueller investigation. And I think all, except for Manafort maybe, all of them, it's because they lied to investigators. And in Roger Stone's situation, what he's lied about, I don't think was even criminal in any way, so I can't sort of figure out why he was lying.
Well, you know, his lawyers have made noise, and so has he on all the weekend talk shows, because he loves to talk. He's a joy for a journalist. The lawyers are coming forth with the idea, well, he misremembered. Well, the problem is he lied about dumb things because there were text messages. It's not like they didn't exist. It's not like you can say, oh, right, I forgot what I said 6 months ago, and you refreshed my recollection. But there's written records here. So whenever he decided that he was going to go in and testify, what he did was he obviously didn't review any materials that he had. The other wrinkle in all of this, which we do not know, and only the Mueller people know, is that there were all kinds of electronic devices and boxes of documents that were seized in the raid on Friday. So we don't know what else may be in there that may lead to what we call a superseding indictment that would be more charges or different charges than have been charged in the original arrest.
You think, you know, I can understand the argument about misremembering, so that's why you weren't, you know, upfront with investigators when they were questioning you about your relationship with WikiLeaks. But then there's this other charge of witness tampering, where, according to the indictment, he's basically trying to pressure this radio host, Randy Credico, to give investigators the same story that he gave them. You know, if it was the truth, then you wouldn't have to pressure him to tell a story. You would just say, tell the truth, Randy. But according to the indictment, he threatened his dog.
Well, I was just about to say, when you tell someone you're going to kill their dog, that really gets people up in arms. And I say that somewhat facetiously, but I'm not kidding. I mean, you know, it's one thing to say, you better do this or else. And people look at that as a threat. But when you say, you better do this or I'm going to kill your dog, people get crazy.
Yeah. So of course, you know, we're talking about sort of the details of the indictment, specifically with the charges that he's facing. But the greater conversation that got everyone talking had to do with the connections between senior Trump campaign officials and Roger Stone. No one, and the various conversations that they had, in which it certainly appeared like this senior campaign official had a serious interest in these email dumps by WikiLeaks.
Well, what we have is paragraph number 12, and in paragraph number 12 of the indictment, what we learn is the most significant paragraph in terms of how it connects or may connect to the Trump campaign. Because it is said on July 22nd, 2016, you're in the heat of the campaign for the election in November, that a senior Trump campaign official was directed to contact Stone concerning WikiLeaks dumps. So you not only have the senior campaign official, but you have the big question of who directed the senior campaign official. So when we hear things like Matthew Whitaker saying yesterday, frankly, improperly, or never supposed to comment on a pending investigation in the Department of Justice, but to say that it would be Mueller's investigation would be coming to an end soon, and then to basically get the hook and get off the stage because that was an inappropriate comment, that if it is coming to an end, well, what about an indictment of that senior campaign official and perhaps the person who directed him, or is there going to be nothing?
Right.
So the Washington Post and other news outlets are reporting that Roger Stone has entered a not guilty plea at this arraignment. We were expecting that. He had said that he was going to do that. So what happens next?
Well, they will set another date for a status conference. And what happens in these situations is the defense will file motions. There will be a hearing date set for those motions, whether it's a motion to dismiss the indictment or counts in the indictment, motion to redact parts of the indictment, whether it's a motion to suppress statements. There are all kinds of motions that get filed, and a hearing date will be set for that. In the meantime, it really is up to Roger Stone's lawyers if they should want to approach Robert Mueller's office and decide if they should have a conversation or not. Now, one of the things we have learned over time with Roger Stone is he has repeatedly said he will not bear false witness against the President of the United States. But we have never really heard Roger Stone say he will not bear let me rephrase that. We have never heard Roger Stone say that he's not going to say what happened during the course of the campaign concerning other people involved in the campaign. We have heard him say that he believes no one in the campaign did anything wrong. So when I hear the news, which I'm listening to 24 hours a day, or at least every hour except when I eat or sleep, and sometimes when I eat, that the news gets really excited about the fact that, oh, Roger Stone is changing his position and he may actually cooperate with Robert Mueller. I don't expect Roger Stone to say anything to the Mueller people, if they even want to talk to him at all, which they may not, that is going to incriminate anyone in the Trump campaign. You have to believe that Robert Mueller and his people know exactly who the senior campaign official is and who directed the senior campaign official, and they don't need Roger Stone, who is an agent provocateur and an open and notorious liar.
So then why go after Roger Stone if not to, gain more information? I know he lied, to investigators, but you don't have to charge him.
Well, you don't have to charge him, except that he becomes a link in all of the questions about what was Russia doing with the election. You have to remember he was even in contact on email with the Russian intelligence agency when they come in as Crucifer 2. Roger Stone is someone that clearly the Robert Mueller people don't like. They don't like what he was up to, and perhaps they really do believe that he had advance notice on when this WikiLeaks dumps, plural, of the Clinton emails was going to happen, and that they believed that that was primary interference with the 2016 election.
So let me ask you, Ricky, since his arrest, Roger Stone has basically almost invited a federal judge to impose a gag order on him. In fact, he tweeted something like, to mute him is the direct wish or the fervent wish of the deep state, right? Why is he saying? Why is he doing that?
Well, I don't know that he's invited a gag order. I think that
if you're a judge, would you see that and say, you know what? Let me put the kibosh on this.
Well, then you have to put the kibosh on a lot more people than Roger Stone. You have to put the kibosh on lawyers, but you can't put the kibosh on journalists. And so you have at least 3 major networks on cable news that are devoted 24/7 to what is happening in Washington, and in particular to the Mueller investigation. Obviously, on both sides of the arguments, and you can't stop them from talking.
So we just got some notes here from our producers about what actually happened in that courthouse. The magistrate judge took the bench at 11 a.m., which we'd been saying. She noted that Mr. Stone, appeared voluntarily. She reminded him he does not have to make any statements about the charges. They were then. There's a whole bunch of notes here, but essentially what we know is that he, according to various outlets, has pled not guilty.
Yeah, it looks like there might be a status hearing again on February 1st, rather.
Yeah.
February 1st being Friday.
So,
yeah.
And here, just let me just.
That doesn't. Well, that doesn't
make any sense.
Odd.
Oh, okay.
To me.
So maybe I'm not. Let's see. Inform the judge who will be overseeing the case has requested a status hearing February 1st.
I wonder if that may have something
there will
to
be a
do.
status hearing.
We'll find out from Jeff Pegues and Paula what the reasoning for that. It may have something to do with his lawyers.
So
I mean, it's way too soon. It's Friday.
It seemed like that, yeah.
Here are the key players. Judge Deborah Robinson is presiding for the special counsel's office. The prosecutor is Jeannie Rhee, and prosecutor Aaron Zielinski, and for Roger Stone, L. Peter Farkas and Grant J. Smith. I've seen Mr. Farkas on various cable networks. He's been out there in the past, sort of well known. Robert C. Bushell. So and we can see the live pictures there of all the crowds of people that are waiting for. You have some pro Roger Stone people, and you have some people who are not so pro Roger Stone. Paula indicated earlier that this was sort of going to be a circus. Ultimately, I mean, it's what Anne-Marie was saying about whether and how much of a player Mr. Stone is in what is out there with regards to...
It depends on which Mr. Stone you believe. The one prior to the Mueller investigation where he was bragging about all his connections?
All this stuff, and
or
the one who's now...
the one afterwards when he realized that, hey, this Mueller investigation is a real deal, and then suddenly his story about his connections and interactions with Julian Assange changed. We saw he did an interview with Jeff Pegues where he said, just because I said I communicated with Julian Assange doesn't mean I spoke to him.
What does that mean?
Wherever did you get that idea from?
So we have,
well, no, he's saying through an intermediary, I think, is what the argument is when you look at the indictment, right? But that's not what he was saying before, very publicly.
But you have to understand how thorough Robert Mueller is. I mean, this is not El Chapo. This is not a show trial.
Right.
This is a real case. And it's a real case because what you had was Roger Stone fibbing to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence. You don't do that. For heaven's sake, that's why Michael Cohen is in a mess.
And you talked about that earlier this week, Ricky. We were talking about that Washington Post article, and we interviewed one of the reporters who wrote that story with Josh Dawsey about all these individuals, and the president keeps saying no collusion. Others say there's nothing wrong here, it's all for lying. But then why were so many people lying to Congress, to prosecutors about contacts that they've had with Russia?
The question.
To me, that's the biggest question. I don't know anything because I haven't seen what Mueller has seen. But all these questions, the one that I sort of question myself is, why do you have to lie? Why did Michael Flynn lie? Why did Manafort lie? Why did, we know why Cohen lied. He's told us why he's lied. But why all these lies around one thing? Well, and
it's why the Washington Post article is so provocative, because it's a very difficult question to answer. It's almost a rhetorical question, because we also don't understand why the president and those surrounding the president have always been really interested in working with Russia on all kinds of things, including their private businesses. Part of that is the obvious answer, is that it appears they needed financing from time to time for various projects that they couldn't get in the United States of America. So did the fact, if we go back to Michael Cohen, did the fact that President Trump, then candidate Trump, was pursuing this Moscow tower during the 2016 campaign, which then causes Michael Cohen to lie, he says, at the direction of the president, which may or may not be true, that they push the date back so it doesn't look like it was happening during the campaign, and that now you have all the questions about the sanctions that are, we suddenly find out, I think it's yesterday, that Deripaska is now getting millions upon millions of dollars by the sanctions being lifted. And some people in Congress are saying, well, maybe I shouldn't have voted, the way I voted. We have never had such a preoccupation with the Russians since the Cold War. It's very, very peculiar, which is why, in great part, we're intrigued and very concerned about the Russians influencing, which every intelligence agency agrees, that the Russians did not want to. They did influence the 2016 election through hacking and other means. And then they probably also, it will be shown, influenced the 2018 midterms. So now we're concerned about the 2020 elections. And in the meantime, we lift sanctions. I mean, there's something wrong with this picture.
Just sort of looking at the list of people close to the president that have been indicted. We talked about that, starting with George Papadopoulos. I know that, they sort of said that he was a volunteer, sort of a low-level guy.
Well, everyone gets diminished.
Right. Totally. Even Paul Manafort.
Well, even Roger Stone.
Right.
I mean, it's like...
Low level.
Yeah. Low-level volunteers.
The coffee boy, the pool boy.
Completely. But,
I hardly knew him.
George Papadopoulos had attempted to make contact with somebody that he thought was sort of part of the Russian, and so he pleads guilty to lying to the FBI. Rick Gates, Paul Manafort's junior assistant or whatever, business partner, also pleading guilty.
Let's talk about Rick Gates for a second.
Talk about him.
Because Rick Gates must be a gold mine of information, because every few weeks, if not months, Rick Gates' sentencing keeps getting postponed. Why? Because he's, quote unquote, continuing to cooperate with the Mueller investigation.
He must have a lot of info.
A lot of info that seems like a spigot that will not turn off. And so never diminish the fact of what Rick Gates may be currently sharing, including the fact of whoever may have been the senior campaign official and who directed.
Well, he worked very closely with Paul Manafort. Paul Manafort
basically
obviously not cooperating.
Paul Manafort's in a real jam. Paul Manafort's going to prison for a long time.
Yeah, and Rick Gates, I think he even admitted to stealing from Paul Manafort. I mean, I believe that because it's just they're complicated characters for sure.
All of these characters, though, it's interesting to me as we keep talking about the jeopardy that they are in. Only one, Michael Cohen, has said that his family's life is in danger. And that he's being threatened.
And he's not kidding.
And you don't think he's kidding?
No, I think,
when I say kidding, I mean like
I think he firmly believes that after the comments that were made by both the president and Giuliani, that his family has reason to worry. And Michael Cohen has become an enormously sympathetic character in the public domain. We read in the local papers, meaning New York local, that now he goes into restaurants and people want to take selfies with him, and he's been applauded as he's entered or exited a restaurant. And why? Because they really, in many ways, think he has become the one truth teller. On the other side of that, they also feel terribly sorry for him.
Well, he's sort of like, I think out of all these characters, they are all still saying that they did nothing wrong, and he's actually come out and said, yes, I did. That may be a part of the deal that he made with the prosecutors, but it does feel like, I think there are a lot of people who project onto him. They say, look, I would know, I know what it's like to be with a person who's famous or a boss who's very powerful and who gives me a lot of authority and grants me a lot of attention and gives me money and all these things that go around with that. And, there are people, I'm not saying that everybody would do that, but there are some people who say, I could find myself in a situation like that, working for somebody who's all powerful, who's famous, and has, the commands attention wherever he goes. And he asked me to do something, I feel intensely loyal to him. a lot of people can relate to that. And now he's like, I was duped the same way that perhaps a lot of other people would.
Here's the thing about Michael Cohen that I think makes him, a serious threat to Donald Trump, that because you don't hear the Trump administration, or you don't hear the president or Rudy Giuliani threatening people the way they have with Cohen, but he has very intimate knowledge, not just of the campaign, but Donald Trump's business and his personal life. He's the one with the money and the porn star, and so he's connected in sort of all three areas of Donald Trump's world. That's pretty powerful.
And we have to remember this. Objectively, we don't know that this was a threat, either comments on Twitter from the president or Rudy Giuliani, or it was just comments.
Yeah.
But Michael Cohen clearly perceived them to be threats to his family.
Rudy Giuliani was a mayor of New York City. He was the district attorney for the Southern District. Would he not know that by making comments like that on television, that's somebody interpreting that, a judge, Robert Mueller, would say, why are you saying that way?
Well, I think that Rudy Giuliani would say he has a right of free speech, and that he made a statement of fact that the family of Michael Cohen, particularly his father-in-law, bears looking into, and that I understand why Rudy Giuliani said that. I mean, I would not have said that, but it is not necessarily objectively a threat. It's just a statement. And it's a statement of saying that Michael Cohen is not as pure as he tries to be. And why not? Well, in part because his father-in-law isn't either. The truth or falsity of that, we have no idea. But the reality is that I don't think, despite the fact that Rudy Giuliani, who once was one of the most respected people, particularly after 9/11, as being America's mayor, and now has put himself in the situation not of really being a lawyer, but of being a spokesperson, and of being there in order also, like Trump's tweets, in order to distract, that I don't think Rudy Giuliani believes that anything he has said has any criminal intent or would be criminalized in any way. And in the world of free speech, he's 100% correct.
So we did get a 2-minute warning, I guess, of sorts, that Roger Stone will be appearing very shortly. I don't know if that means we see those microphones set up. I don't know if that's for his lawyers. I don't know if who knows? He likes the limelight, so he might get up there and start talking. But
in Fort Lauderdale, his lawyer came out and said no one speaks for Roger Stone. He speaks for himself, and then he took the mic. So
yeah,
well, he's a larger than life figure, and he enjoys the spotlight, despite his comment, which you may have interpreted as wanting to be gagged. I don't know that Roger Stone really wants to be gagged.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to make of him, because he's had a long career going back to 1972 in Washington. He is Donald Trump's he's known Trump for over 40 years.
And one of his very early backers,
that's right,
when Donald Trump just started to sort of muse about the possibility of being president. He was right there.
Yeah. So I mean, you're right. He's his own individual, and maybe we will hear from him. And I'm guessing that's why there are so many cameras trained on him.
Well, there's certainly hoping to hear from him. And considering his statements in Fort Lauderdale right after he got out of court, and his Nixon victory sign.
Right.
And do you know anyone else who has a tattoo of Richard Nixon?
I don't know anybody who has a big picture of, when I was watching Jeff do his live shot with us yesterday, and Jeff Pegues, and right over Jeff's shoulder was a big framed picture of Richard Nixon.
Yes,
and
one of many he owns.
Well, I'm actually anxious to hear from Jeff, who we will hear from, because this really is Jeff's story. He has been following Roger Stone for a very, very long time, and knows things that most of the rest of us don't know. I mean, I may know what happens in a courtroom and what the process is from here, though I will say the February 1st, that's Friday.
That's odd, right?
Unless it has something to do, as I say, with the lawyers. It just doesn't make any sense to me.
So let me So we were just talking about the gag order, and I'm reading something here from the Washington
Please.
Post. They're talking about the U.S. District Judge Amy Berman Jackson of the District of Columbia. In other cases, quoting the Washington Post here, assigned to her, Jackson, a former federal prosecutor, white-collar defense attorney, and 2011 appointee of President Obama, has not been reluctant to rein in attorneys and parties whose out-of-court comments she found likely to lead to pretrial publicity that might taint a jury or jeopardize a fair trial.
Well, it may be a good idea to silence Roger Stone. You're not going to hear anything from the prosecutors in this case. You never hear anything from the Mueller shop. I mean, virtually never. And the only statements we've heard about cases have come out of the Southern District of New York at the time of Michael Cohen. I mean, you just don't hear anything from Mueller.
Apparently, so we forgot this, but she issued a gag order after an attorney for Paul Manafort gave a statement outside the federal courthouse attacking the special counsel's investigation and defending Manafort to reporters in 2017.
And didn't Manafort, maybe you can correct me, didn't Manafort get in trouble because he was directing an op-ed and he wasn't supposed
that's
to
correct.
do
That's right, yeah.
any of that sort of stuff?
That's, you know, I'll tell you as a lawyer, there's the journalism part of me. Even though I don't consider myself a journalist, I consider myself a legal analyst, but I work for a network, this network. There's the journalism part of me and there's the lawyer part of me. The journalism part of me wants to get everything out in the public and let's hear it, let's see it. And the lawyer part of me, when I was practicing law and had very, very big cases, I would never say this out loud at the time, but boy, oh boy, a gag order was the best thing that ever happened to me, because then I didn't have to answer questions and I didn't have to have press conferences and I could just do my job. So it was a blessing.
So yeah, I think we've blown past that 2-minute warning. So
there was some processing that needed to be done before Roger Stone could come out. You know, he's under sort of the same legal restrictions that the judge brought up in Florida. The judge in Florida had asked about his passport and that sort of stuff. So there's probably some restrictions that they have to kind of like, they have to sort of hammer out, and he probably has to sign documents to indicate he's not going to be leaving the country or leaving whatever. And so that's part of what's taking the time here.
It just is, again, going back to our discussion about why these individuals felt compelled to do what they did. We were talking earlier, I think it was to Paula Reed, about the fact that this sort of all started when the president decided to fire James Comey.
Yes.
And led to the creation of the special counsel.
And Steve, as Steve Bannon says, the worst decision in political history.
History. And maybe in hindsight, looking, he made that point to CBS News several months ago. And I remember thinking to myself, really, in political history, there have been so many important moments, certainly in American political history. But as this drags on, you start to maybe think to yourself that he may have had a point in that through this one act, these actions that individuals took that individually may not have seemed like a big deal. I'm going to get some, I'm
going to DM Guccifer.
Yeah, I'm going to DM Guccifer. I'm going to have a little chat with Julian Assange about what he knows, and maybe that's going to help my client.
It's naivete from people who, not Roger Stone and not Paul Manafort, they've been in the business, but it's naivete.
Is that him?
I don't know.
There's a lot of
movement.
Running,
a lot of movement. Let's see. Is there a sound on this? Let's get some sound on this.
Odd that they would be walking.
Let's see what they're saying.
Lock him up. They're screaming.
Pandemonium. It must be him.
It is him. I think I see his hair, his signature. What?
I'm actually surprised he didn't speak.
Yeah.
This way.
Into the car.
So it looks like if that was him, and we think it's him, it's hard to know. It could be a head fake. You watch him stroll out the other way. What I would do. Yeah, but
we don't know. But if that's him and he didn't speak, that's sort of out of the character.
Well, maybe the judge really did reprimand him and his lawyers and said, knock it off. And whether she issued a gag order or not, that they also know they're they're talking at their peril. One thing is very important that I think we should not neglect here, because the defense has said it from day one the administration said it through Sarah Sanders, and it's really important to remember. Roger Stone was not charged. with conspiracy to defraud the United States. That's very, very important because that's the charge that means collusion. And I think that we have to differentiate between what he was charged with, which is far less egregious than the conspiracy charge, meaning collusion. And that if Robert Mueller has the evidence of conspiracy to defraud the United States, is he saving it for a superseding indictment involving the senior campaign official and the person who directed him, or does he just not have it?
Interesting. What about Jerome Corsi? So he's like person, I think, number one in this indictment. He's suing the Mueller investigation.
Yes.
Right? Is he just a peripheral character?
I think he is a peripheral character, but he's not a peripheral character when it concerns Roger Stone. I mean, that you have people who have been dealing with each other for a very, very long time. But I think that as far as I know, it's not that Corsi has information that is going to make the difference when we look to if Mueller is trying to go up. Now, that's a great question for Paula Reed.
You know, we were talking about Jeff Pegues, our justice and correspondent, and I'm just curious because as we read all these articles, we watch that documentary about Roger Stone.
Get me Roger Stone.
Get me Roger Stone.
It's really so fun. I actually went back and watched it again.
A lot of people have,
are doing
yeah.
that. A lot of people are doing that. I plan to make that part of my weekend plans too. And I just think to myself, does it strike anybody who has covered Mr. Stone all these years that he has any real political convictions? In other words, the devotion to Richard Nixon seems to be less about the things that Nixon tried to do or didn't do for the United States of America and more of a personal devotion to an individual than it is to an ideal. In other words, you and I can admire George Washington or FDR or Abraham Lincoln, and I don't know anything about Abraham Lincoln other than the things that he did for this country, and of course the little tiny details that we all learn in school, right? And so I wonder if there's a sense from people who know Roger Stone that he, for example, really believed that Donald Trump was the right person to fix this country above all the other candidates who were running, or it was just about winning and losing and the game of politics.
Well, it may be a little bit of both.
Yeah.
We have to remember that he's been a right-wing conspiracy theorist for a long time. Certainly someone who enjoyed the birther conspiracy
Yes.
about President Obama. And that it may be just a part of, as you put it, a part of the game, or perhaps he really believes he's a patriot, and that this is the right person for the job, that he believed so decades ago and believes so now. The reality is that may be part of the macro picture, but in the micro picture, the real question is who's charged, who's going to be charged, and who may or may not be proven guilty.
We were just showing you some video from
Friday. From
Friday, yeah. That was in Fort Lauderdale. That was not now. Obviously, he's in a T-shirt, but that was his attitude coming out of the court in Fort Lauderdale, and that's after having an early morning sort of raid on his house, FBI agents tearing through his house, acquiring stuff, as Ricky pointed out, being in a cell, showing up in front of a judge, and then he emerges from the courthouse and gives the
Nixon
peace
victory.
signs.
Yeah.
And I've heard so many people comment about the quote-unquote Gestapo tactics, an expression that just makes me crazy.
Right. Yeah, what was your take on
You
that?
diminished what the Gestapo actually really did by suggesting that the
Exactly
FBI
correct. And Anne-Marie, you and I spoke about this on Friday. And as a former prosecutor, state prosecutor who worked on federal state investigations together, this is not an uncommon tactic to go in at 5 o'clock in the morning and to wake somebody up from a dead sleep. And the primary reason for that is to seize documents, electronic devices, cache of goods, in order that someone could not destroy them. That's really the primary purpose. And the other is, as I put it, is to shock them into wakefulness and understanding that this is real.
Right, and in this case, you know, one of the things that you read in the indictment is that Roger Stone is continually saying, well, there's no documentation. We didn't use emails.
Right.
Like, you know, he's denying that there's anything there, so you can see why why.
anyone know about text messages? It is 2019.
Exactly. So, all right, let's stand by here at the desk because we've got both CBS News Washington correspondent Paula Reed joining us now, as well as Jeff Pegues. He's also standing by to chat with us. First to you, Jeff. I know we've been seeing some of the briefing notes from your producers that have been coming to us on through email. Just describe the scene, the moment when Mr. Stone entered that not guilty plea.
Well, in the courtroom, it was quite subdued. I mean, we didn't expect him to do anything other than enter a not guilty plea, and so that's what happened there. What we were looking for was whether the judge would impose like a gag order, because obviously Roger Stone has been on a bit of a media blitz over the last several days since his arrest on Friday. That didn't happen either, and so that was notable. And then he left the courthouse. We suspected that perhaps he might make a statement. He didn't. So in some ways, this is a Roger Stone that we don't recognize, because, you know, even when he showed up in Washington yesterday at the airport, he was followed by a media circus because he has been commenting on this case. He told me over the weekend that he wanted to get his side of the story out before he couldn't do that any longer. In other words, he was expecting a gag order. He didn't get it. But over the weekend, he was talking as much as possible, trying to get his story out because he wanted that on the record.
Hey, Paula, we were reading about a February 1st hearing. Can you give us a little more insight into what that's all about?
Well, that's right. I mean, the reason they didn't impose a gag order today is because he appeared before a magistrate judge. This is a lower level judge, and typically they can't really impose things like gag orders. But when he appears before Judge Amy Berman Jackson, the judge who will oversee his case, it's pretty much a guarantee she's going to impose a gag order. She imposed a gag order in the case of Paul Manafort after his lawyers said some pretty simple boilerplate lawyer things. My client is innocent. She got very upset. She told the lawyers that this will not be tried in the court of public opinion. She didn't want any statements that could potentially influence jurors. So I absolutely expect Roger Stone will still get that gag order, even though he didn't get it today. But something that will be really interesting to watch in each of these hearings. Today, the special counsel noted that they're trying this case jointly with local U.S. attorneys. So this is the first time that we have seen at the beginning of a case the special counsel has filed that they're working alongside U.S. attorneys not assigned to the special counsel. The reason that is significant is because it makes it easy to pass the case off to those U.S. attorneys if and when the special counsel closes shop and the case is still going. Again, it's just another sign, this coupled with the acting attorney general's comments yesterday, that the special counsel investigation could be wrapping up.
So, Jeff, let me get back to you for a second, and then we'll jump back to Paula. You interviewed Roger Stone. I know you said he's been on sort of a media blitz, but you got an opportunity to meet with him and interview him inside his home there in Florida. Just remind our viewers some of the things that he said in response to your questions about WikiLeaks, about what kind of communications he may have had with WikiLeaks or Julian Assange or Guccifer or any of these individuals, and perhaps the reasons why Robert Mueller feels that these 7 charges are going to stick.
And also, Jeff, how what he said to you, and you've had a few interviews with him, contrasts with what he has said at other times in public.
Right.
Well, he seemed to soften in his position on whether he would cooperate with the investigators. You know, Roger Stone has been someone who has been, in many ways, parroting the president. He's called the investigation a witch hunt. And so he has taken a very hard public line against Robert Mueller. But over the weekend, when I spoke with him in his living room, where he has an image of President Donald Trump, images of Richard Nixon, images of Ronald Reagan, he seemed to soften in his position, seemed to suggest that maybe he would cooperate at some point if there is an avenue to do that. He didn't commit to doing that, but he seemed to soften, and I thought that that was interesting given his public stance in the past.
You know, not just that, sorry, you know, a couple of days ago, we played an interview that you did with him a while back where you were really sort of pushing him on this idea that he had been corresponding with WikiLeaks because he was bragging about it. And it kind of sort of goes to what's in the indictment, that he was saying some things publicly and then started to change his tune, and he did it directly to you, and he sort of played a game of semantics with you about communication and talking and what that means.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because early on in this investigation, and at that time when we spoke to him the first time, this was still an investigation that was being run by FBI headquarters. It wasn't in the hands of the special counsel, but we knew that Roger Stone to be a focus because in the late stages of the general election campaign in 2016, he seemed to have these predictions about when these WikiLeaks disclosures would occur, which we were following the investigation at that time and the campaign at that time. And we thought that it was interesting that he seemed to be able to foreshadow what was going to happen. And I had intelligence sources at the time who said, well, this is happening for a reason. Is there someone on the American side coordinating with Russian operatives to time these releases? So we always knew that Roger Stone would be someone that investigators would scrutinize closely, and his contacts or alleged contacts with WikiLeaks, because according to the intelligence community in this country, WikiLeaks during the 2016 election, at the very least, was operating as an arm of Russian intelligence by releasing the stolen Democratic Party emails and datas at specific points. These releases were happening at a time when events would occur potentially to the benefit of the Hillary Clinton campaign, but it would switch the news cycle dramatically and get some negative focus on Hillary Clinton rather than positive focus. And that's why people in the law enforcement / intelligence community felt like these were coordinated actions that seemed to influence the news cycle in a way that potentially benefited then candidate Trump.
Paula, before we let you and Jeff go, let me ask you about, because you're there at the White House, the president hasn't tweeted a whole lot about Roger Stone the way he has, for example, other people that he's not a fan of anymore. But he did on January 26 tweet this. CBS reports that in the Roger Stone indictment, data was released during the 2016 election that damaged Hillary Clinton. Oh, really? That's what the president wrote.
Oh, really?
Oh, really? What about the fake and unverified dossier, a total phony con job that was paid for by Crooked Hillary to damage me in the Trump campaign? What about all the one-sided fake media coverage, collusion with Crooked H that I had to endure during my very successful presidential campaign? What about the now revealed bias by Facebook and many others? Roger Stone didn't even work for me anywhere near the election. Forget all the other stuff that we can't fact check in the short time that we have with you. Roger Stone didn't even work for me anywhere near the election.
Not a very robust denial there, because really the question, the legally consequential question, is did the president know that Roger Stone was continuing to update his campaign about WikiLeaks planned releases? And was the president the one directing those senior campaign officials to continue cooperating with Stone? That really is the question. But we've seen this before. The White House, when it comes to any of these, Roger Stone is the 6th Trump campaign advisor or associate to be charged in the special counsel investigation. And the White House tends to do two things. First, they paint them as the victim of some sort of politically motivated investigation, and then they try to distance themselves real fast from that person. And that's what we've seen here with Roger Stone. Even yesterday at the White House briefing, they wouldn't shut down the possibility of a pardon for Stone. So they're trying to do anything they can to maybe discourage him from flipping and cooperating. But most of the witnesses in this case, their ultimate decision to cooperate, as all of them so far have had to do, was based on their finances and their family. It is quite a tall order to go up against the special counsel's office. So even if people hope for a pardon, even if they want to remain loyal to the president, just the cost, both emotional and financial, of having to fight through a trial has been too much for all of the defendants.
Paula Reed for us at the White House. We thank you. Jeff Pegues at the courthouse there. Jeff, thank you so much. We look forward to your reporting later this afternoon on CBSN and tonight on the Evening News. We thank you very much. Ricky, you've been here with us through thick and thin, through El Chapo, now to Roger Stone. We thank you, as always, for your sharp legal analysis, as always. Thank you, Ricky. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we're going to have a lot more news. There's a lot to digest today.
Oh, yeah.
Although it wasn't as crazy as the Friday
that you weren't here.
I wasn't here for. Anne-Marie kept it rowing.
Or like this, doggy paddle.
With our crack team of producers in the control room.
Indeed.
You know, but yes, I was certainly thinking of you when I was in California.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much while you were in California. Tell us more.
Reporting on a very important story.
Tell us more in the break.